Good afternoon and welcome to the session on urban transitions in India. Um, as people start streaming in from lunch, hopefully, um, the way the session is structured is as follows. Over the next 2 hours and 15 minutes or so, we'll begin with a very short presentation on the kind of work that CPR does in the urban space with some brief examples. Then we have our panelists whom you have in the booklet before you. We have Kazuo Nakano from Sao Paulo. We have Fedor Kudryatsev from Moscow. We have and I'm coming west to east, so Stephanie Tavalamaramal from CNRS and CIS in Paris, and Ivan Turok from Johannesburg. I'll broadly moderate the session. And then, a few of our panelists have, again, short presentations to make to outline the kinds of broad issues that are occurring in their countries. And then we'll move to the panel, which we hope to be a more interactive discussion. And what I will do is, at periodic intervals during the panel, I'll throw it open to the audience for questions, so that you won't have to wait right till the end to ask questions. But that also means that I will limit questions from the audience during that period of time, so that we can get the panel on and moving as things go forward. I'm still to see whether the Manish, is there something needs to be removed to put on something there? Is there a revelation that's about to take place? In a moment, okay. So as and when the mysteries are ready to be revealed, just let me know. The way we structured this particular session was to ask one question, which I think is important from the way we look at urban policy as well as we look at urban cities. And that question is, what is the role of the large metropolis? And is the urban metropolis also the future of urbanization? The reason why you're asking the question hopefully will become clear in a short while, but I'll allow you to think through that particular question for a while as we move into the sessions going forward. Mukta,
Prakriti, can I have the clicker, or would you like to operate the slides? Okay. Welcome everyone to the session on urbanization. My job here is to give you a short glimpse, sort of a showcase of what we do in the urbanization focus area at CPR. I'll be brief, but we do like a chance to showcase our work, so do bear with us for a bit. Next, please. So our work on urbanization here has not been so much about cities as about processes of urbanization. What really intrigues us is how does urbanization fit into the larger transformations that are taking place in India, some of which are economic, social, political, and cultural. And we feel that urbanization intersects across all of these and has a bearing on all of these and is in turn impacted by all of them as well. So one part of the question is, of course, how? How does this process play out? Does it have something to do with the location of these places? How is it affected by governance arrangements? What about the history of settlements? How does that impact processes? And then that, of course, leads us as a policy think tank to the question of what are the interventions that can be made if we lay out processes or understand processes in particular ways. But then there's also the who of this question. Who is participating in this process of urban transformation? Who's making decisions about structures of governance, about what happens where, and who's negotiating what? And what's relevant to India is that people are negotiating for economic advancement, for social emancipation, and for political participation. And what does the urban do? Or what does the urban enable for all of these processes of change at the level of people, whether they're individuals or communities. So as a former prime minister would have said, ye sab hoga kaise? How is all this going to happen? Next, please. Um, it, the work that we do is certainly not being done by this stellar team of a few researchers who belt out, all this fantastic research. We have a multidisciplinary approach. Not only our own team members who work at CPR work across, come from a number of disciplines. They're all listed there, but they're really varied, even delving into from the medical sciences to look at health and urbanization intersections. So that's as far as we go with the multidisciplinary stuff. But also our partners and networks are also drawn from a very wide range. So this has always been a very collaborative effort on our part, and these collaborations continue to grow over time. So starting with the workshop series that we have in place, and many of you have come to these workshops over time. We're on our 107th workshop as of today. You're already participating in it, which we have in collaboration with CSH. We have collaborations with other French institutions, IRD, CNRS. Our sci-fi initiative, which works on sanitation, also collaborates with state and city governments in states of Odisha and Rajasthan, as well as civil society partners. We have a set of partners which look at comparing urbanization processes in India and China. These include the India-China Institute at the New School in New York, but also Chinese universities and design centers, especially in the southern China area around Guangzhou and Shenzhen. A new collaborative project called Tacit Knowledge Urban Research Network, which we've been involved with, has actually built on friendships and collaborations that we've had with other leading research institutions within India that work on urban issues, like the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, IIHS, which is the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, Hyderabad Urban Labs, etc. Today's panel showcases CPR's collaborations with the BRICS City Lab, which again looks at comparative urban experiences across the BRICS countries. Back, please. Yeah. We've also been lucky in some of our research projects partnering with civil society actors for understanding our work on migration. We not only partnered with other research organizations, but actually tapped into a very wide network of civil society actors who were working on ground on issues that migrants were facing at source and destination. Similarly, other projects too have had collaborations. We've also engaged with civil society and government, not necessarily strictly within the bounds of research projects, but as ongoing engagements, sometimes to support them, sometimes to be part of their activities. So, for example, housing rights and right to the city coalitions in India, but especially in Delhi, have been, we've been part of those. Of course, members from our team have served on government committees, working groups, groups that have done survey designs for the NSS, etc. And this is an ongoing process as a policy think tank. Today, we're going to focus on a few themes just to sort of showcase the work we do. The first is our work on urban transformations in the urban landscape. And here our focus is that beyond the big cities, we want to draw focus to the urbanization processes that are playing out in small towns and across the countryside. The second focus area that I'll discuss today is the sanitation initiative, and here we're going to look specifically at service delivery mechanisms and how is sanitation delivered to these transforming places, which are not just the big cities. The Cities of Delhi project, which I'll focus on as well a little bit, looks into neighborhoods within Delhi and looks at this from the perspective of citizenship. How do citizens negotiate service deliveries? How do specific neighborhoods and places experience service delivery in different ways? And how state actions themselves then impact these neighborhoods and citizens that live in them. Next, please. So we'll start with the first one, urban landscape. The team is very proud to have been part of the work on subaltern urbanization in India. This book came out last year, and one of the co-editors, Mariellen Zera, is in the audience, and I'm sure many of you have interacted with her over these 2 days. the underlying thought behind this, we have a team in the urbanization cluster that does works with large data sets like the census, and this is actually the transformation. What has driven urban population growth between 1991 and 2001, which is the latest census for which we have migration data, and as you can see, in contrast to China, where a large proportion of the urban population actually has been added through rural to urban migration. In India, the net effect of rural to urban migration is only 20 of the 90 million that we've added in that intercensal period. And in fact, a substantial transformation is the figure to the right, which is 31.8%, which is through the reclassification of large and dense villages to urban. So that's the census towns work from CPR. So this is something that always strikes us as getting missed out of a lot of debates in research and policy as more and more people, as people have traditionally focused on larger cities in their research work. So we've tried to draw attention to this in our work, recent work. Next, please. And the way that's sort of we've thought about it is it's not just moving people, which is migration, and that's something we study too, but it's also morphing places, that is in situ changes. And we need to look at both to really understand what the urban transformations are. Essentially, these morphing places are morphing because of the change of occupational structure from farm to non-farm activity without people actually moving locations. And so the attention has to be sort of dispersed geographically across a much wider area within India rather than focused on urban clusters per se. Next, please. And this also goes to show that, again, the urban growth is spread across a large number of cities. The white bit on the top of every graph, and we're moving from million plus on the left towards smaller cities as you move right. The white bits are the bits that were added in the intercensal period, that is, in addition to natural growth. And you see that the census towns have actually grown, added a lot of new population, which is consistent with my last slide. Next, please. The sanitation work again picks up on this importance of this large variety of urban centers that we have and asks the question of how are these going to be served by sanitation infrastructure, by sanitation system? Do we need to move beyond traditional networked systems of sanitation service delivery? Next, please. And here too, the sort of is quite multidisciplinary. It looks at legal issues. A lot of, for instance, the regulatory frameworks for implementing a lot of these new systems are not in place. So there's work to be done there, and it's being done. There are engineering aspects to this. There's the idea of the economics of how this is going to work, and of course the behavioral aspects of sanitation, which is something that policy in India has been quite aware of with the Swachh Bharat mission. The research team, again, is not just CPR, but CPR's collaboration with state and local governments, sometimes in extremely small municipalities, as well as civil society partners that work on the ground. And also a large, next please, a large network of international, because the water sanitation policy environment is not just particular to India, it's situated within a larger push towards water sanitation efforts and the sustainable development goals, etc. So this is just to show the different kinds of activities, and it's quite a varied project which picks on not just the capabilities of our team, but also intersects with other urban analysis, like analysis of current government policies, etc. Next, please. The Cities of Delhi project, and these snapshots are from our website. This has its own sort of microsite within our website, and the reason why that has it is because it's a real deep dive, next please, into a number of different categories of settlements that exist within Delhi. And Delhi is sort of a case to show how complicated the settlement structure within Indian cities can be, from a planned sort of settlement, which is less than 25% of the city, to an array of other kinds of settlements which experience different kinds of regulatory frameworks and are on the spectrum of legality, illegality. And again, we shy away from binaries, so we don't want to call them either legal or illegal. So these are the kind of places where we worked, and we focused on places themselves, where we sort of dive deeply into the settlement itself, its history, the kind of experience that they have with service delivery, the processes through which governing institutions were delivering the services themselves, and the institutions themselves. How were they structured? How were they able to or unable to do certain things that they had in their objectives? And this is how the website is set up too. You could go and look at that. And this project sort of really speaks to the who of what I put up right up front in the how and who when I was looking at those two. And the focus here has been differentiated citizenship. So that how do these diverse degrees of formality, legality, and tenure actually impact citizenship in different parts of Delhi, and how do then people negotiate, how do citizens negotiate for improvements in these services, and what are the neighborhood effects here? And what we've looked at really are a very granular understanding, and we believe that that sort of granularity is necessary to then zoom back into the larger picture and look at the interventions aspects. And last but certainly not the least is some work that we did in the largest, sort of 10 large cities in India, and which looks at the question of social emancipation, which again was on the first slide, and shows that Ambedkar's dream of cities being these spaces of emancipation is still in the process of being realized. And this is work that shows that we, SC/ST communities in large cities, are still living in an extremely spatially segregated space. And that even service provision is concentrated and is sort of differentiated depending on the social groups that live there. So space and the spatiality of everything matters is sort of the way that the urbanization team at CPR has looked at a range of issues, and caste is another one of those things in which space really matters. Next, please. I'm going to invite Partho now to take on from me as we move into the last section of this presentation, which then segues into our panel for the day, which focuses on the future of the urban and asks whether that is in the Metropolitan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mukta, and my apologies for subjecting the audience to a whole bunch of self-promotion. This thing move? Yeah, it moves. Wonderful. Urban work in CPR essentially owes much of its growth, arrival, and initiation to Mr. C.K.C. Shivram-Krishnan, who was, until his passing a few years ago, our chairman. And when he came to, he started working at CPR even before he joined CPR on urban governance. And one of his final projects was essentially about governance of megacities. But urban governance in India is just governance of the urban. It's also governance of places which are not technically under urban governments, and those are special economic zones. And that was another space that got some work done. Incidentally, all these publications that were referred to, etc., they're all outside. If anybody wants to take a look at them, most of them are downloadable from our website, but feel free to sort of go through them as and when the session breaks. Broadly speaking, but before I do that, let me also, since we have three countries, and I've put in China for reference, here, this is just to show that the notion of the urban is very different depending on which country you're in. In Brazil, Russia, and South Africa, who are represented on the panel here, Stephanie I consider to be from Delhi. You have a situation where you're looking at, it's largely a legal definition. Whatever the government decides to call urban is urban, which is also true in India. The state government could technically call a municipality of one or a settlement of one an urban area. There's nothing we can do about it, perfectly constitutionally possible. But in India, we also have that other statistical definition, which is creating a lot of problems because all these places are statistically urban but not administratively urban. But that's, so when we look at different rates, urbanization, you'll hear Russia is 70 X% urbanized, South Africa is 67% urbanized, and so on, and India is 32% urbanized. You must remember that you may not be comparing apples to apples. The second thing is, in India, of course, urban comes in many flavors, as I said right at the beginning. And the notion of the metropolis and a region beyond the city boundaries is actually quite an old notion. Began with Delhi Development Authority in 1958. It's only about 11 years after independence. And has come through a variety of what we call development authorities that have come with different areas. And this is the kind of areas that we looked at to define the urban region. In these development authorities, you've been hearing about power, you've been hearing about environment and structures, and all of these things are done by a variety of people in these kinds of spaces. You have, even as far as planning goes, there are also a large number of planning agencies which control the use of land in these particular areas, right? The net result of all of this is if you look across our large cities, they are cities with a variety of adeva. So they come with a variety of types of settlements. So apart from the core city, there are large numbers of what you call census towns, other urban local bodies, which is other towns which have legal character, and a whole lot of villages in these particular areas, in and around these particular spaces, right? And most of these places around these villages obviously are not doing farm work. This is sort of the average percentage of farm work that is happening in the villages around these large cities. The average across all of them is more than 50%, but of course it would be 75% to be statistically urban in India and a lot more to be administratively so. And the core issue that I would like to point out here is this is a new technologies that we all use now. So we use night lights, which is new fancy stuff that is used for research. And frankly, the idea being that the brighter the light, the more developed the places. This is sort of the intensity of the brightness. This is data from the World Bank Spatial Database. And what we do is essentially, this is the core city. These are the other statutory towns in that area. You already see a huge drop between the intensity of these two places. These are the census towns, the urban areas which are not classified as urban. As you can see, these are not non-comparable. But then when you come to the villages, you hardly see them. So even around the biggest metropolises of this country, the degree of inequity in terms of where you live is stark. So what's the government doing about this stuff? Not this government. This government is doing a lot of other stuff, and we did some work on smart cities, we did some work on other stuff which you'll find outside. Let's look at the previous government. And even the previous government basically spent a lot of money on the bigger cities. Right? And then we look at, if you look not at governments in terms of the big cities, within a big city, what does it do? We looked at government actions in Delhi itself as part of our Cities of Delhi project. And here are 10 actions, and I won't go into that in detail. We can pick them up during the panel discussion, where essentially the actions of the government are actions that increase inequality rather than reduce it. So the question, therefore, is for these big cities, can they really be the pathways out of poverty that we're looking at? Can they really be engines of this transformation if they're going to actually reduce, essentially lead to increased inequalities going forward? Is there something inevitable about this desecularization process? And as was discussed yesterday, the one part of the issue is, to what extent is it the case that the nature of our economic systems, the nature of our urban forms are essentially inevitably leading to the kinds of outcomes that are resulting in the kind of popular anger that we are seeing on the streets now. How do these large cities relate to these big settlements around them? And I just showed you the relationship to the villages in that particular area. The big city itself was born from a certain economic system which essentially was about high volume manufacturing. As technology is changing with Industry 4.0, 3D manufacturing going forward, you're getting from mass manufacturing to mass customization. Is the big city still the ideal form? It could be, for a variety of reasons, where small cities actually are very small firms like to exist in big cities. So is it still, what role does the big city provide? How large, the reason that people get fixated on big cities is because this is where all the innovation is supposed to take place. And I must tell you this wonderful story that happened yesterday when Fedor was having dinner. And the dessert table was laid out, and I wasn't taking care of him. So I neglected to tell him where the dessert was. Fedor went out and decided that the moong dal halwa is actually a cereal, which is it, and mixed it with some mutton curry. Let me tell you, it tasted quite nice. And that is the kind of serendipity that drives innovation in large cities. Right? That's the kind of structure. So how large do they have to be? Do they have to be 20 million people like Delhi? Or can that kind of serendipitous innovation also happen in a city of 500,000? Right? And finally, this is one issue which has dominated our workshop at various points, including the previous panel. So the issue is this large urban form the better form for climate change, friendliness of the urban transformation? If we are to become urban, does becoming urban through big cities mean that we save the planet, more likely to save the planet? We might not save the planet anyway, but we are more likely to save the planet if we become urban through these large cities or through the small ones. These are just some of the questions that the panel will put up. There'll be a whole bunch of other things that I'm sure. And we have, right after this will be 3 quick presentations which give you a sense of what the other 3 large urban systems are like from Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. And then we will move on to the panel discussion. So if I can just have the next presentation, please. We have Ivan Churak.
Great. Thanks very much to Center for Policy Research and Partha in particular for inviting me here. I'm very pleased, indeed excited to be involved in this event. It's really fascinating for me, coming from South Africa. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes to give you a bit of a factual background to inform our discussion interaction later on. I think it's important to set a context, to give you some pictures. I'm sure very few of you have been to South Africa, so it's important for me to do that. And some facts and figures. Okay, so a few lessons from South Africa's trajectory of urbanization. If anybody knows some work by a guy called Johnny Miller, these photographic images he has been producing in the last year or two, they're very striking images of inequality and segregation, polarization within cities. He's recently published a book on this, and many of his images, probably most of his images, I haven't actually bought a copy of the book, I confess, but they come from South Africa because of the extreme disparities and polarization of cities in South Africa, reflecting the history, but also continuing inequality within the country. But a final point on this is actually this analysis of his is misleading, because the number of settlements where the rich and the poor live cheek by jowl is actually quite few. By and large, poor people live on the periphery, a long distance from the rich, right? And that was the whole purpose of apartheid, to separate, not to allow rich and poor to live together. So if we can move ahead, that's great. A very simple factual background. I wasn't going to include these, but I'm going to, because I think it's important to put Africa in a context. This shows the proportion of the global population that will be, and that is and will be urban in the next few decades. The dark red is Africa, showing the significance of urbanization in Africa to the global future. So the questions Partha is ending on is critically important for this continent, but also the continuing, and over the next decade or two, increasing importance of Asia at the bottom in dark blue. More particularly, the significance of India. When I saw this, it struck me that India is such a crucial a country for urbanization. So it's absolutely appropriate for CPR, it seems to me, to focus on this as one of the key themes. India, in terms of absolute contributions to the future urban population of this planet, is fundamental. If India doesn't get it right, that has dire consequences for the planet. Okay? Then Africa also emerges. That's the other key point I just wanted to make from this. So we've got Nigeria, and then Congo, and then most of these other countries, each of which make a small contribution, but together very significant, are African. Most of those are African countries. Africa is really significant for urbanization over the next few decades. And then this point about megacities. This is a single slide to comment on the role of megacities. So it's often said that people are increasingly concentrated into big cities, big megacities like Delhi, like Tokyo, like Shanghai, and so on. In fact, the rate of growth, and this is what this shows, the rate of growth of the big cities, that's these large red blobs in different continents, Africa, Asia, etc., compared with the megacities, the large cities, the medium-sized cities, and the smaller cities, you could see that there's no distinctive pattern. Looking back over the period 2000 to 2014, you can't say, basically the growth has been distributed pretty evenly across the urban hierarchy, right? So growth has not been concentrated within either the biggest cities or the smaller towns. It's quite widely dispersed, and it will vary a lot in different countries. I don't know what the situation in India is or it will be, but I'm just saying globally, there's no obvious concentration, and there's some of the alarm signals about these enormous cities that are unsustainable. That's not borne out by the experience of the last decade or so. That's that simple point. So then my second point I want to make is about the relationship between urbanization, the demographics, which I've just looked at, and economics, okay? Because that's fundamental. That relationship between demographic growth in cities and economic performance is critical. If we don't get it right, it's an urbanization of poverty and inequality, as Partha was saying, rather than an urbanization that contributes to prosperity and inclusion. So this is a simple framework to show you some more facts and figures. The urbanization happening trajectories, I'm going to show you the figures in a second, but up on the vertical scale is the growth in the urban population of each country, and then on the horizontal scale is the growth in per capita income. Okay, so if you have all your urbanization with no economic growth, then you're getting an urbanization of poverty, leading to slums and other consequences of that, unmanageable urbanization without the funds for infrastructure investment. The alternative is space doesn't matter. The urban areas are insignificant. So what is the actual pattern? So this is looking at 3 continents over the period, a 3-decade period. The first is Latin America, where we see that as these countries at a high level of urbanization, these countries are by and large urbanized, as they've urbanized a little bit further, they've also prospered in terms of economic development, okay? So in every case, as these countries have urbanized, this has contributed to rising prosperity in terms of average incomes. The same is true in Asia. Lower levels of urbanization, but rapidly growing economies. China, of course, the outstanding story, moving from about 25% urbanized to about 55% urbanized now, and this dramatic improvement in average incomes over that period. India's there in orange, not such a stellar performance, but pretty typical at lower levels of urbanization. And then we look at the African story and we see serious problems here. This model that urbanization, according to UN Habitat, is a transformative force for prosperity. It clearly breaks down. There are serious problems around urbanization in Africa, and the pattern is much more like urbanization of poverty than around urbanization and development. South Africa is there as a bit of an outlier, but you could see South Africa is also not capturing the dividend, the premium of urbanization for prosperity. And that's because, and I'll move on now to my third point. In fact, just before I do that, let me just say that this story is confirmed by other indicators. This is just life expectancy. You see this generally positive pattern here. As cities, as countries have urbanized, health and life expectancy have improved in Latin America, in Asia, but not in Africa. And this is South Africa up here, where life expectancy during this period actually fell because of particularly HIV/AIDS and other consequences of that disease. So clearly a salutary message against those sort of proponents of urbanization automatically leads to reductions in inequality and rising prosperity. It's not automatic. It depends on governance, and that's the kind of discussion we're going to have in a second. The third point I want to make is that in South Africa, we have tried to suppress urbanization under apartheid very, very extremely and forcefully, and since apartheid by a kind of a denial of urbanization, right? So it's not a forceful prevention, but it's not a positive embrace of urbanization. And the effect of it has been problematic, as I just want to illustrate very briefly. So this is the pattern of urban and rural population growth, absolute growth. You could see that under the period of apartheid, or probably unique in the world, the rate of population growth in urban and rural areas was the same. The government actually wanted to stop. It wanted a horizontal line. It didn't want urbanization, but people found their way through loopholes in the system. But amazingly, the two coincided together for several decades, the growth in urban and rural population. In other words, migration was stemmed. But since then, there's been this rebound effect, and so people have been moving much more rapidly towards cities. And we're now here at about just before 2020, where the rural population is declining, and that's very, very significant. But there's a kind of, as I said, a sort of denialism in many aspects of government policy, not across the board, but in many areas, and that has profound effects. We can discuss maybe later, but one obvious one that you may have heard about is Day Zero, right? In Cape Town, the city I live in, basically a lack of investment in water infrastructure and dams to recognize and accommodate and prepare for urban growth has led to these adverse consequences of insufficient capacity in the systems to accommodate urban population growth. So another symptom of this has been the distorted urban form, basically putting the poor on the periphery of the city where the opportunities are very limited. So this is Cape Town, this is the Cape Flats here in the southeast of the city, and all the opportunities here around the central city and the northern and southern suburbs. An extremely segregated and distorted urban form. This is the population density on the left here, showing very high densities on the periphery and very low densities around the core urban area, all the jobs around the core, leading to this enormous spatial mismatch and massive transport problems for a city of this kind. So some of you have images of Cape Town, a world-class tourist attraction, but on the other side of it is these very poor informal settlements with very poor infrastructure and facilities, vulnerable to shack fires, vulnerable to flooding, vulnerable to all sorts of other problems. This is Gauteng, the heartland of the economy, Johannesburg and two other major cities in there. This is the economy of the city in the heart of the area, benefiting from agglomeration economies. These grey areas are the major black townships built under apartheid. And then what I wanted to show is just the plans for new housing settlements, okay, these blue areas. And you can basically see the pressure now to sort of respond to housing backlogs cheap land on the periphery of the city, reinforcing that segregated city that was inherited from apartheid and leading to very extreme and unequal travel to work patterns. The red is the travel to work patterns of white people who are middle income and higher incomes, shorter travel to work patterns. The poorer black people living on the periphery of the city, traveling further and spending much higher proportion of their income on transport. And this pattern is being reproduced by spontaneous settlement patterns. So this simply shows the informal housing on the edge of the city, around the periphery, in and around the existing townships, where people can access a little bit of land here and there in order to settle. And backyard housing similarly reinforcing this segregated pattern of development on the big cities. A simple illustration of government housing policy providing small units for people, and then within only 9 years, in massive informality in the backyards of these properties, leading to populations 5 or 6 times higher than their original intent, and causing all sorts of problems of overloaded infrastructure in these areas that were not designed to accommodate such large populations. This is a kind of image of these places, double-story shacks, very, very vulnerable to fires, vulnerable to poor air conditions and so on within these informal settlements. Transport being a massive cost to individuals and to the public sector to try and subsidize a little bit the cost people exposing. A very inefficient urban arrangement as a result of sort of reactive planning rather than proactive planning for the future. And I want to end now just on a positive message, because I can't give you a completely bleak picture. So there is although government policy is kind of absent to a large extent here, we'll get into the details in the discussion, but there is a positive story of sort of spontaneous positive development happening, in particular around urbanization. Okay, so this graph shows that the change in employment over the last decade against the change in population, right, for all the cities in South Africa. And you can see how there is a kind of positive general correspondence. The places that have had strong jobs growth have had strong population growth. Not through any plan, but through spontaneous people recognizing these are the places of opportunity, right? Johannesburg there is the largest city, followed by Pretoria, Cape Town, Ekurhuleni, and Durban there. The 5 big cities of the country, attracting people in broad proportion to their economic change. And this has not been a good period of economic performance. South Africa's economy has been doing very, very badly. Nevertheless, as I say, the sort of spontaneous process of migration has kind of sorted things out a little bit. Okay, people moving from these poor rural areas in the Eastern Cape and in the north of the country and the Free State, the blue areas are the areas of population decline, towards the big cities in Gauteng, Cape Town, and Durban. And this has had, when you measure the effects at the individual level, and this really is my last point, this has had positive effects on individual living standards and incomes. So this shows the proportion of people above the poverty line. Below the poverty line. People living in poverty. And there are 3 categories of people. It's a panel data set, longitudinal, people who live and continue to live in rural areas. The proportion in poverty, 80% poor over the period 2008 to 2014, coming down a little bit through government grants to poor communities, poor rural communities. This is the urban population, also a slight decline in poverty, much lower levels of poverty at the beginning, and this is the people who migrated from rural to urban areas. And you see how quickly their profile changes to match that of the urban destinations where they end up. In other words, that migration decision is a very rational response. It lifts people out of poverty, and it has had a significant positive effect. And roughly 380,000 people, we estimate, which is very significant in a South African context, have been lifted out of poverty by that simple physical relocation to the city. And it's shown up in basically through the labor market. People managing to access some kind of livelihood or employment in the big city, and this is helping them to get out of poverty. So, thank you very much.
Sure. Uh, so as you can see, interestingly, in India, that migration story is the migrants in the cities actually look to be better off than the city residents themselves at times, because in principle, they select them, the ones who get to migrate are the people at the upper end of the rural scale. But these are, may I now request Kazwo to present the other story. Of course, a city which has been making a lot of news recently, if you have been following the city of Sao Paulo.
Good afternoon. I think that I'm going to be next to the screen because I'd like to point some aspects of the map. But first of all, I'd like to thank CPR and particularly Professor Partha for the invitation to participate in this interesting dialogue about the urbanization context in different countries and continents. Well, do you have the point? Okay, so yes, because I saw that Ivan was using that.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I prepared a short presentation about the Brazilian context in order to help me to address some issues about the themes approached in this panel. First of all, here we have the roadmap, and Brazil is here in the South America, and here is the metropolis of São Paulo. This graph shows the evolution of the urbanization rates in the second part of the 20th century. And we can see that in 1950, 36% of the Brazilian population was in the urbanized area, and 64% was in the rural areas. And this urbanization ratio grew constantly in the second part of the century until reach the 85% in 2010. And this period is characterized and named by the researchers as the national developmentalism period, because the national government promote an industrialization process which contribute to development of the country, but this national developmentalism occurred without a welfare state, without social policy. This is why we are one of the most unequal countries of the world. And here we have one of the products of those urbanization process, those accelerated urbanization process. This map shows the 12 urban systems that we have in the Brazilian territory. We can see the different urban systems represented in different colors, in yellow, blue, pink, and what else? So we can see that the majority of the urban systems in Brazil are concentrated in the coast zone. But we can see these vectors of internalization of urbanization systems here and here. Those vectors are directed to the Amazon forest region, which are here. So here we have the Amazon rivers, and we can see some cities here alongside these big rivers. And these urban systems are polarized by the most important metropolitan areas of the country, represented by this red circle and orange circles. So we can see that the urban systems located in the north and the northeast part of the country is less dense comparing to the urban systems located in the south and southeast part of the country, and is less diversified, as we can see in this map. Here in the northeast region of the country, the urban systems are polarized by the metropolitan areas and cities with local importance. The median systems, the regional poles, are represented by this orange square. It's not at the same quantities that we can see here in this southeast and south part of the country. Here, in this part of the Brazilian territory, we can see the urban systems which are more dense and more diversified, because we have the metropolitan areas with national and international importance, like São Paulo, which is here, and Rio de Janeiro, which is here. So we can see the cities with local importance represented by these small green circles, and the median cities represented by this orange square. So we can see the densities of the cities which are close to each other here in São Paulo and this part of the Minas Gerais states and in the north of Paraná. So here in the south part of the country, we have 40% of the national population, and the economical importance of those urban systems is represented in this graphic. So here we have the urban system polarized by São Paulo. This is one polarized by Rio. This is another one polarized by Curitiba and Porto Alegre and Belo Horizonte. All these urban systems are located in the southeast and south part of the country. More than 80% of the gross national product is produced based on this urban system located in the southeast and in the south part of the country. The urban system polarized by São Paulo is responsible for almost 40% of the gross national product. And this economic importance of those urban systems have some paradox, some contradiction, because, as I said before, the urbanization process in Brazilian country occurred in a national developmentalism context, without welfare state, without social policy, which distribute the richness produced by this national development. So here we have the urbanized areas of the metropolis of São Paulo, which have 39 municipalities, and we can see the representation of the inequalities which are in this metropolis, which are very important in the country because it is the largest one and the richest city in Brazilian country. Here we have in purple the areas which concentrates the formal jobs here in the central part of the metropolis, we have about 60% of the formal jobs, which are concentrated in this central part of the city. And here in yellow and red, we have the areas in the peripheries which concentrate population in poverty situation and vulnerable situation. And the millions of people living in this part of the metropolis urbanized areas have to commute daily for 1 hour or 2 hours to go to their workplace. And here we have some image of this central part with the concentration of formal jobs in commercial areas, office building. And here we have an image of the settlements located in the peripheries. And here we have a map which shows all those poor and precarious urban settlements located inside the environmental protection areas and the watershed protection area, which is here and here. So we have these kind of urban settlements located besides the water reservoir, which is very, very important for us, but it's getting more and more polluted by the sewage, domestic sewage produced by all these settlements. So this is what I want to share with you, and I'd like to finalize this presentation saying that now we have a federal law which obligates the state government to prepare a metropolitan plan to face all these challenges. I would say that these challenges, the metropolitan governance is one of the most complex challenges that we are facing in the country. But the implementation of that federal law is going in a slow pace, you know. So we have to learn a lot of, with other experiences abroad, how to structure metropolitan governance, planning, management systems to face these big challenges from the social, environmental, and economical point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Kajo. And we'll now ask Fedor to come up and speak about the Russian experience. As you can see from the experience in Brazil, it's not necessary that the country will actually evolve to a common urban system. Brazil, with a population of about 200 plus million, has evolved, and the two lessons I took away from it, into multiple urban systems, but also the power of the state. That state intervention can actually change the shape of your urban system. It's something that one needs to be concerned about, given that we often in India think of the state as being unable to do too much, but the state does have the power to affect considerable change. We therefore need to be careful to see whether it's been exercised in the right direction. Fedor.
Thank you, Parta. First of all, I'd like to say again thank you to Parta and to CPR and to President of CPR. That is a really great opportunity. And it's my first time in India, and it's really fantastic, I would say. So I decided that to pay attention to, I think, very basic issue of relationships between the cities and the state. And then I think in Russia it was very important, probably in India as well. We'll see. So this is the illustration of current situation, and as you see, not exactly current, it's a little bit, there's time lag from this picture, but anyway, the situation is the same. I mean, the urbanization level is more or less stable, about 75%, and it's not different, it's not changing fast. And therefore, I will just go to some history of Russia and the cities and their role in creating the Russia. So this is a Russia which is now, but if you look at this small dot, it's just a very approximate area of the initial Russia, which it was just starting from many centuries ago. And this very moment, it was kind of princedom, and I would like to underline that, of course, it's very much simplification, but it was monarchy and, say, self-governance combination. Yes, it was. What was interesting that at that, say, about 17th century, 16th century, there were about 20% of population in city. They were kind of a creative class. I mean, of course, in the commerce. I mean, it was people who was neither craftsmen nor noblemen. They were absolutely free to undertake everything they want. And I think it was very important because they can create something new. And these new undertakings were very useful for development of the country as a whole. And then since centuries, that grows to the Russian Empire. But of course, the government was changing along these centuries. But anyway, I think this general principle of very centralized power and at the same time quite high initiative in local places, partly because it was just not possible to control everything. Yes, the space was too large to control everything, and people sometimes were just forced to solve their problems by their own resources in some outdated areas or in some emergency areas. And the urbanization rate in the Russian Empire in that time, in the beginning of 20th century, was about 15%, which was, I think, not so small for this period of time. But then the 20th century has come, and it was absolutely different story because country went to a lot of disturbances, and part of them were, say, endogenous, I mean, internal one, and other was external one. And I decided just to split this story to two parts. One about this rural population, and I liked very much this photo. It was a good photographer who made photos about all Russian Empire. I mean, he visited many places. And so I like this picture because it's very calm and very nice. Yes, it just seems that the future of these children will be absolutely perfect. But if you look, don't see. Okay. On the left graph, I just collected here different, say, bad things and bad events which happened in the life of this generation, and also underline only famines. I mean, 3 famines and wars and civil wars and some, say, reforms which really destroyed the rural communities and rural life. And if you look on the city life, it was very kind of, say, contradictory at time, because on one hand there were a lot of cities that were constructed and developed, also due to the industrialization, for example. But at the same time, a lot of cities were destroyed in the war, and it was quite difficult to build them again. So, from point of view of population, the total loss, I mean direct loss of population during the 20th century in Russia could be estimated about 50 million of people. I mean, just direct loss. We don't calculate the potential, how to say, in the next generation. Okay. And so what we have now is kind of a fragment of the bigger city system that was formed in the previous time. That is a big problem. You see, this system is quite dominated by Moscow now, because in the previous time in the Russian Empire, yes, on the left, it's more balanced, and then became less balanced, and now it's a kind of disbalanced situation. But anyways, the system is still quite complex, and there are about 1,000 of cities, and some of them are very small and some are very big. But the governance now is going to be more and more centralized. I think it's kind of controversial things about that the city system is complex, but governance more simplified. Some tendencies is just shrinking national population. You see that it's some areas are quite strong decrease, and migration. But it's interesting to see that the patterns of migration is changing. Yes, I mean I won't go to details, but it's different. Yes, I mean the first decade I think was about migration from the former Soviet Union, and nowadays it's more migration inside the country. And this migration is growing quite fast recently, as you see. There is a specific feature about the migrations, kind of seasonal migrations. I mean that people leave the cities in the summer, going outside to live for some months, and then they come back to the city for the winter, which I would say quite reasonable from the point of view of climate. So as far as the metropolitan areas are concerned, there are now 15 cities with a population over 1 million, and the number of these cities are growing, because recently there were only 12. But again, there are some cities are growing, and 4 cities are shrinking between the biggest situation, and the fastest growing city was not Moscow, by the way, but St. Petersburg. Just briefly, I can say what advantages and disadvantages of these big cities. That one, and maybe the most important advantage is just a better quality of life, a better developed human capital. You can see here example of Moscow, which is more or less equal to the other global cities. But I think one of the most strong challenges for the big cities is that, to my mind, they can't support themselves, their own infrastructure. I mean, this plan for development of Moscow infrastructure is really big, but I think but city needs a lot of federal nation level support to do this. It means that money which were collected all around the city, it's going to only big cities, because if they don't go there, it means that the city just collapse. And then, just to conclude, nowadays, the picture is that the cities should strive for this federal support. And, for example, this is an example of Vladivostok, which started to grow after the national government decided, okay, this is an important area for us, put there a new university, some global events, etc., etc. But if the city didn't manage to do that, it is quite difficult for the city to strive for development. And therefore, the medium-sized city is maybe the most vulnerable, because they are not enough strong to bring this nationwide attention. But anyway, just to conclude, that local initiative that I was starting from is still very important and still matter. And you can see here, for example, this is a screenshot from the website of so-called Association of the Most Beautiful Villages of the Russia. I mean, it's just initiative of the villages, not even the cities, but they have their own program of development. They're trying to find some investors, even in a rather desperate situation. And therefore, I think that is maybe that one of the important issue I learned from this story for myself is that ambition of the city is very important. The ambition of their local people. And generally speaking, we have kind of proverb which is really difficult to translate, but it's telling about that. Each city has its own ambition. If there is no ambition, then it has no choices. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sajid. You may as well, could I just invite the rest of the panel up now? A lot of interesting issues that have already emerged. But one of the issues that does thank you. One of the issues that does come out, at least very starkly in the presentations by Ivan and Kaswa is the city, the big city itself, kind of about our initial remarks in Delhi, that the big city is not a very equal city. You have had the phenomenon of the peripheralization both in South Africa and Kasro's wonderful map of the purple areas in the middle focusing on structures. Now, Stephanie, you have looked at Delhi. And when I look at Delhi, one sees let me ask you two things. One, to what extent do these presentations resonate with you in terms of how you see Delhi? And two, as a result of that, how do you think that has affected the politics of the city itself?
Okay, these are two vast and complex questions, and if you allow me, I would start by thanking you and the CPR for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I was a bit nervous listening to the successive presentations because my own work on Delhi has taken a different perspective. I'm a political scientist, so I have been looking at urbanization and what the changing size and the changing form of the city does, but in terms more of its politics, precisely its governance and its democracy. And what struck me while listening to the presentations, and of course these were all short presentations having to grapple with a huge number of complex problems, but the fact is that very little was said about politics, and what was said was usually said in terms of governance. And we are used now, of course, to speak about politics in the city in terms of governance. And I think that is, we need to reflect about this. And my plan today was to kind of advocate a stronger use of the notion of metropolitan democracy. I think it would be interesting when we think of cities, of metropolization, to interrogate, to ask ourselves about the very possibility of metropolitan democracy and about the possible forms, the possible actors, and the possible problems of metropolitan democracy. And I think by using this phrase, we will be forced to consider the multiple scales of the local, and that was mentioned already in several presentations. When we speak about the local, we speak about the neighborhood, we speak about the sub-municipal, the municipal, the regional, and sometimes, of course, the influence of the central level of government on local politics. But metropolitan democracy, just like governance, actually also forces us to keep in mind the idea that in cities, political actors need to interact with economic actors, but also with cultural actors. And there is a cultural power of the metropolises, for instance, in the fact that media centers are in metropolises most often, which plays a role in the way the cities are governed. But unlike urban governance, the phrase metropolitan democracy forces us to think about democracy precisely, and forces us to consider the idea that democracy does matter. And I think it's important because not only from a normative point of view, but also from a descriptive point of view. If we want to understand what is happening in cities, we have to consider two facts which are in tension with one another. The first is that large cities today are governed by a mode of governance that is largely neoliberal. We're used to thinking in terms of management of the cities, in terms of stakeholders, in terms of partnerships, not so much in terms of citizens' participation and democracy. But cities are also places where democratic innovations take place, which usually take the shape of participatory devices. And this is very clear in Delhi. This is what I've been working on in the past few years. Delhi is a place where a succession of participatory experiences have taken place. The Baghdadi scheme, Johnson Vice had taken place, more recently the Mohala Sabaz, introduced by the Amani Party. And this is interesting because it is taking place, this new participatory effervescence is happening in a place where political representation has been weaker than in the rest of the country. The quasi-state of Delhi is very recent. The government of Delhi, the legislators of Delhi have less power than elsewhere in India. And in this city also, we have participatory experiences which offer different avenues of participation to the citizens. So I didn't answer your question, but I made my point, and I think it's important that we engage in.
Let me push you on that a little bit and ask about to what extent do you, and go back to the extent to which you feel the nature of participation. You mentioned the Bhagidari scheme, which began from the sort of formal colonies of Delhi. And when you look at the cities of Delhi structures that we came through, it began by trying to offer participation to a certain class of citizens. Your junction-wise and your Mohalla Sabhas seem to have taken that same concept but moved it to a different space in different kinds of structures. So do you think they were essentially trying to emulate? So there is a democracy that takes place among the elite and the formal cities, and all these people in formal settlements are trying to be them, and that's what they are trying to do? Or is there something more structural, more basic, rooted in terms of, as you said, the core idea that as a city, I belong to this place, and therefore I have certain rights that I can claim from this particular area. Do you see that more as imitation or as an empowerment kind of structure?
I don't think there was imitation. I think both the Baghdadi scheme and the Mohalla Sabhas, because Johnson-Bai is a bit different, both these schemes were made precisely to develop a different kind of politics, even though, of course, one objective, for organizers was also to strengthen their own position as politicians, as usual. But both schemes certainly do have an empowerment potential. And I think, for instance, in Delhi, it's very clear, it has been shown by many people working on the Baghdadi scheme, Dia Mera, Asher Gertner, people in the CPR, of course, have also seen that the Baghdadi scheme was actually inviting residents of the city to interact, to communicate on their problems with, very basic local amenities such as water, electricity, parks, etc., to interact on a regular basis with the state administration. So it would rely on neighborhood associations and organize big workshops in which these issues were discussed. And what was interesting to observe was that the scheme started in 2000, lapsed officially in 2013 when the chief minister who had put this program in place was defeated in elections. But a whole process happened over these 12 years or so, whereby what we call the middle classes, the urban middle classes, which is a huge understatement to actually speak about, the people who are really the elite of the city. This was a moment when this section of the population engaged with politics, whereas previously these people had tended to abstain a lot in elections, especially in local elections, considering that the stakes were not high enough, or that, that was not their concern. So the Baghdadi scheme has produced a mobilization of these urban middle classes much beyond, actually, RWAs, much beyond the objectives of the program initiators. And so in that sense, this has been a very empowering scheme. But the scheme has empowered people who already had, some power, some economic and even some political power in the city. So this is again where the tension between participation and representation plays, and I think we must be very, attentive to this phenomenon. The idea is not to celebrate blindlessly, the development of participatory democracy, because at the end of the day, voting, the right to vote is the most equal way of participate that we still have in India as in other democracies, I guess. So it's important to really pay attention to the way avenues of political participation interact with the classic political representation.
So Ivan, cities are very vigorous political spaces in South Africa. Now, but is most of this mediation Stephanie is talking about, is taking place not through the mechanism of political parties as much, but through these mechanisms of extra political organizations that are interfacing with the government bureaucracy. Earlier, the Mohalla Sabha is slightly different in terms of how that structure is coming through. But in South Africa, for instance, what is the mechanism through which the citizen participates in expressing his or her beliefs of how the city is moving forward between elections? Elections, obviously, as Stephanie said, is one singular point of expression, and we have, Brazil has just gone through one of them, the others are sort of coming through. But between that structure, do they use the political party system, or is it largely an informal set of networks and structures that people sort of engage with? Those access to these various services, the access to the jobs that you showed, which moves into the come out of social networks, that comes through connections with political systems. What are the, as we said at the beginning, at CPR we try to think about the process through which each of these things happens. So what is the process through which this participation takes place?
I think the first point to make is that there are few processes for constructive engagement about the future shape of the city, all right? And that's maybe a weakness, a sign of the earliness of our democracy, that we don't have lots of forums for dialogue and engagement across different stakeholders to discuss the way in which our cities should develop or are developing. So the net result is that there are two different ways in which much of the participation takes place. The first is protest by social movements. So the cities are hotspots of vigorous protest activity in different shapes and forms, particularly by the poor and the dispossessed, advocating for housing, for sanitation, for basic rights, and protesting mainly against the state for poor delivery, putting it simply. And that creates a kind of opposition between the state and community, which maybe undermines some of the potential for constructive engagement about the future. It's very reactive, it's very siloed, it's topic specific rather than more holistic. The second form of contestation engagement is around the middle classes, defending their territories, defending their position within the city, and using legal frameworks, the right property rights, and the right to consultation, the right to participation on environmental matters, the right to resist encroachment, to resist any threats to their well-being and prosperity. All right, so resisting positive change, basically, within the city. And they're highly, of course, middle class, geared to knowing the full scope of their rights and using them to the best of their extent, hiring professionals, lawyers and so on, in order to make their case and to resist change within the city. All right, so we need to find these forums for constructive engagement and building a more shared sense of the future of the city.
And in a sense, when the poor are protesting against the state, is there also an implicit claim that they have? Are they defined claims that they can receive certain kinds of, for example, in Delhi, one interpretation of our law on the supply of water, the agency which supplies water says that it will not give household connections to people in certain types of settings. And therefore, it's difficult for the households to demand that, except that they can demand a change in the law, and I'll come to that at some point in time. But within South Africa, are these rights that these people have but are not enforced yet, and so are they demanding their rights? Or are they actually, or is it still a political negotiation that's taking place between, as you said, the people who already have it and the people who are are yet to have it?
So there are important rights in the Constitution. The Constitution is a very important document, but the Constitution says that some rights are non-negotiable or kind of compelling. The right to education, and I think basic sanitation, for example. But then there are other rights that are more, the commitment is vaguer. It's subject to resources being available, such as the right to housing. There's no right to the city, so there's no holistic right to all the basket of goods and services that you might expect from moving to a city. There's sector-specific, and there's the qualification that the get-out clause for the state, that if the resources aren't available, then it allows a kind of ill-defined situation to arise. But in principle, the rights are important. They need to be extended, and there are strong arguments that they should be made more specific.
And there's very few platforms where the people who are defending, quote-unquote, the middle classes, and the people who are claiming can actually get together and negotiate.
That's right. There are very few of these claims because of the segregated nature of the structure of the city. It also means that efforts to devolve and decentralize to enable sort of neighborhood negotiating forums, people are kind of nervous about them because they could entrench the powers of the middle classes on the one hand and marginalize, ghettoize the poor on the other. So the city is appropriate, in my view, scale at which these negotiations should happen. But our cities are rather big. I didn't say that, but our metros are governed by single entities in order for redistribution to happen. But it's a sort of passive redistribution. So there are taxes on the middle class and then compensating the poor through basic services. It's not a developmental kind of arrangement, right? Because basically the cities don't want to interfere too much with the middle classes in case they vote with their feet and exit the system. So it's a sort of status quo, gentle redistribution that takes place rather than a more dynamic transformation.
We have had that experience with the Land Reform Act a long time ago, but Khalso, from what Ivan tells me, it looks as if the middle class in Sao Paulo seems to have reacted in the manner that he was talking about. Because the way I understand this to Sao Paulo, there was a lot of this engagement that Stephanie was talking about through the mechanism of the political parties.
Yeah.
And there were also efforts to try and redistribute some of these things at the local level. What has been that experience, and in your view, how successful was that experiment, and to what would you attribute, let's say, the current backlash that sort of has recently happened in Brazil?
It's a difficult question because it is difficult to evaluate the results of the participation process in the public policies. But from my point of view, I think that in the last 30 years, the redemocratization process in Brazilian country contributed a lot to improve our policies based on the involvement of the social movement, because the organized social movement in urban areas addressed innovative issues to the public policies, like social housing in the central parts of the cities, like self-management in the production of social housing. The social movements claimed to more autonomous, more access to the public funds, to produce by themselves social housing in the cities. This is a very important experience.
So people are actually financed by public funds to build their own houses.
Yes, and and I think that all this social participation contributed to improve the public agenda in the redemocratization process in the last 30 years. And they involved in public discussions, public conferences, public policy management councils, because our constitution obligates the municipal government to institute management councils in the health policy, public transportation policy, education policy, urban policy. So when the local government organize all these management councils, the social movement, NGOs, middle class, neighborhood participate, and in some case help the local government to formulate and implementate and improve the public policies. But sometimes in some places, all these local management councils are captured, by the conservative forces, and the local government don't want to work with them, so it failed. And I think that in the last 5 years, something changed in all this process in the peripheries. First of all, I think the violence in some big cities increased a lot, and the organized crime, something like mafia, start to act in some peripheral neighborhoods, and it is an obstacle to the participation of the people. And the church, I don't know how to say this in English, it's not a Catholic church, a kind of Pentecostal. Is that Pentecostal? The Pentecostal church increased a lot in the poor neighborhoods, so it competes with the local government in the participation process. Yes, so I think that this is some of the factors that explains what happened in the last presidential election in Brazilian country. And this is what we'll have to
But Kazu, when you were making the presentation and you showed this explosion of informal settlements in especially the water reservoirs, is that an issue that agitates people in Sao Paulo? Are the people who are thinking that what the government is, they should at least be fine, poor can live in various places, etc., but they should at least be able to protect these kinds of places? Are the people, the elite, they get agitated when they see these kinds of things, or is this not something that is really a matter of common discussion?
You mean the public authorities?
The public authorities and the citizens, and the elite citizens, the richer citizens, the people who have got good service, are they somehow feeling that even sort of basic protections like our reservoirs, etc., somehow the state is failing and therefore we must do something?
Well, the public authorities and the citizens start to be more preoccupied since the 2014, because the Metropolitan of São Paulo had a very serious crisis, water crisis, water supply crisis. So the public authorities and the middle class start to be more and more preoccupied with this issue, because they depend on those water reservoirs. But one thing is, the citizens and the public authorities' preoccupations. Another one is the actions, the measures, the investments to face and to solve all these problems. From my point of view, the public authorities are paralyzed. We have the problem, we have the challenges to address this water crisis, but we have the laws, we have the social support in some way, but you know, it is not translated to public policies, public actions, public investments, public measures to prevent all these things. We are acting only in an emergency way. Emergency way. So, well, I don't know what's going on to happen in the future with this.
So, Fedor, feel free to jump in and ask questions of each other. When you presented, I get the feeling from my visits to Moscow and our discussions, the politics of Moscow is in some sense very closely wound with the politics of the country as a whole. But what is the situation of those other large cities that you're beyond that big capital city? Is there more of, especially given the nature of political dominance in Russia, what is the mechanism through which those cities express? Is it largely through the party system? They're all governed by the same party as the one in the nation, and they sort of, therefore, is it an intra-party negotiation, or is it? How do the citizens of those cities essentially see the way to getting federal support, to accessing structures? Because you said some of those cities, especially the smaller cities, have had trouble in trying to access federal resources. How does that structure work out?
Yeah, thank you, Partha. I think that I'll try to explain, but maybe it will be more my personal opinion, and it's not the only one opinion it could be. In the general agenda, I think in our culture there's quite clear aspirations about the powers. They are power, and we are people. But therefore, generally speaking, at the moment, all authorities, I mean, it doesn't matter whether they are in Moscow, in the federal level, or in the regional level, it's, generally speaking, one corporation, to my mind. But it doesn't mean that they're absolutely sorted. No, there are some tensions, there are some groups of influence, etc., etc. But it's not, but these tensions, I think, they are resolved not through, let's say, political process in terms of party competitions or really elections or something like that, but through some other informal relations and discussions, etc., which really are not public. But somehow it could be understood through some gestures or some public, or say, statements, etc. So, therefore, if we can try to distinguish the national, federal power, this regional, and just people, and so how they emphasize their ideas and their interests. I think that oops. I will start from Moscow because it's more easier. Current Moscow mayor, he used to be a head of the president administration. So he is absolutely, generally speaking, authority on the federal level. I mean, his prehistory. So one of the impact on this in negotiation with people is developing of internet platform. It means that they are asking people, just some sometimes more important, sometimes to my opinion quite absolutely unimportant questions like, do you want to have grass in your, do you like to have your leaves from the trees in your yard to be removed or to be stayed in the yard? Yeah. So you can vote for that in just an online platform. Sometimes it would be something more serious, but the problem is that if I would like, as a citizen, to place my own question to the platform, I think it will be much more difficult. But there are some other platforms which are like Change.org or something that we can do it. But it's not through the government, it's just some separate things. And this kind of online platform is quite often used just to trying to understand the opinion of the people. And just give you my personal impression that I visited a kind of local, it's called polyclinic, but really it's not a hospital, just where the, the doctors are. Because it was my first visit during the 10 last year. And then when I come back, I open my email and see that just a letter on behalf of the head of the hospital asking me, please fill just some very simple form. So we'd like to know your opinion about the quality of our services. And so you can just check this one and that one, which I think it works. I mean, they really produce these opinions and trying to adjust the service to these opinions. But again, the initiative is usually going from the side of the power, I think. But another thing is that, of course, there are possibilities to protest, and people protest, and I think that to some extent it's quite similar to what Kanzu was saying, that they're protesting on emergency. I think generally we are Russians, I think, very good in the emergency situation, I think. We're very well organized and very fast and informal. Just doesn't matter what level of power. It's just that we have an emergency. But if there's no emergency, the people, I think it's much more difficult to do that.
What would be an emergency?
No, I will give you an example. There, some years ago, there was a great fire all across the city, or country. The fire on the forest, and is it for me or Parto? So it was a nationwide problem. And some point of view, a moment of time, I think, that the citizens understood that power is not powerful enough to do something with this. And immediately it was organized everything. I mean, there was a fire brigade voluntarily going to these forests, and some equipments were supplied by people, by sponsors, by everything. So it's a kind of example, for example.
Is this kind of internet-based participation also used in smaller cities?
I mean, it used, but I think through more kind of things like social networks. I mean, because the online platform in Moscow was specially designed by the government, so it's quite expensive. So I think local governments are not able to really design it, I think. But they can, yeah, but what is advantage of Russia is that the internet is available almost everywhere, I think, in the village, everywhere. And you can, therefore you are connected to this system of relations, so you can use just, common instruments like Facebook, or we have our ocean of contact system. So they can do it, and I think they do it.
So one of the issues that sort of comes out is the issue of who has the power to set the agenda in terms of what the questions are. And one of the questions that we began the panel with was, is this big city the urban form of the future? Now, when you're interacting, when you're looking at your, a lot of you engage with the technical administrations, engage with the politics of the structures, all of you, most have been engaged with both of them in each of your respective cities. Is this a question that is on the agenda? Are people thinking about whether this big city is going to be the urban form of the future? We found out that, at least in Russia, they're not invulnerable. Even big cities could decline when there is large changes in underlying economic conditions. So is this something that people are actually talking about? South Africa has perhaps it's about 5 big cities that we have put together. Do they feel vulnerable, or is it the case that the smaller cities feel that everything will be going away to these big places, and do they feel vulnerable? Is there any discussion of that particular aspect going forward?
Yes, I mean, it's a big question. I think the secondary cities, we define them as the cities with less than 500,000 people, do feel that they get second-class treatment. That the big five, have privileged access to state resources and to powers, enhanced powers that the smaller cities don't have. But in my view, the big cities don't have the powers that they require to do the job properly, right? We still are a centralized, very centralized system. Although the Constitution talks about spheres of government, 3 spheres of government, implying equality in the status and the power of the 3 spheres, and in practice, the system is a tiers of government with a hierarchy, so that national departments dictate to provinces who dictate to the metros. 9% of state spending happens through the municipal sphere of government. Only 9%, despite the fact that these are, the ground level institutions that are responsible for delivering basic services. They have to access the bulk of their resources from the provinces and national departments, which means that they don't have discretion really to shape policy. So the clearest example of the problem is in housing. We have a national housing policy that's rolled out these very standard housing units, mass housing units, that are really inappropriate in the big cities, where you need density, you need multi-story, you need rental property, but the housing policy doesn't allow for any of those. And so the cities are, frustrated, really, by their lack of capabilities to shape their future, the lack of power over transport. The basic urban planning is about coordinating transport, housing, and land use, right, with jobs. But the cities don't have the power over these key elements to shape the future of their cities.
Is that true both for the large cities and for the smaller ones?
That's right. It's true across the board. There's repeated talk about devolution of these powers, but then the national departments and the provinces resist devolution on the grounds this is their power base, this is their resources, very simple politics of power.
That is unfortunately a problem that we suffer from too. So I was hoping you'd give us a way out of here, but right now it looks like South Africa is an impasse.
Well, there is a debate going on even between government departments. I mean, this metropolitan democracy notion is a very good one, I think. It's a great idea, but it's an idea. It's not a reality. And so the department, interestingly, it's the finance ministry that is pushing this agenda more strongly than the other departments, because the finance ministry recognizes the unsustainability of the current arrangement, and that building houses on the edge of the city is going to bankrupt the cities, basically, because of the cost of infrastructure in a very low-density arrangement, the cost of an ongoing public transport system in a very low-density
and the kind of wages that people would need in order to afford transportation
from
there to there.
Yeah. So Treasury is pushing this, but it's finding resistance against the other departments. And there's been no national leadership to say, coming back to your question, to say our cities are really important and we need to manage them more effectively.
What's the story in other countries?
Well, in São Paulo, from the people point of view, from the citizen point of view, it is there is some ambiguities, because in general, people love and hate the big cities, because despite all the problems, despite the segregation, despite the bad quality of life, the poor people stay there, because in the big cities they find job opportunities, better public equipment, services, and infrastructure. So it is paradoxical.
But is there is the same kind of demands? The Brazilian cities have more power and more finances.
Yes, yes.
If I remember right, Sao Paulo municipality was the second richest government in Brazil after
Yes,
Sao
that is
Paulo
true.
province.
Yeah.
So is there a different kind of articulation? Are they, in terms of setting the agenda, are they offering new models? Are they offering new structures for the city? Does it, I mean, a lot of the discussion around climate, for instance, is, especially in the US nowadays, is that the cities will save the planet, right? Because if the national government will not do it, then the cities will. But do cities really have that kind of power? In India, they don't. In South Africa, if you can't handle transport, if you can't handle housing, it's difficult for you to affect your energy consumption. So in Brazil, do you see that as cities being really powerful actors in national politics?
No.
No.
No. I think that the urban issue is not in the federal government agenda, because we tried to formulate and to implement a national urban development policy, but we failed. In 2005, the changes in the Ministry of Cities contribute to how can I say this? To go back.
Retrospective, retrograde.
Retrogression.
Yes,
Yes.
it happened a regression.
Regression back.
In the process, yes. And now the urban agenda is not in the federal government agenda. They don't pay attention. They don't prioritize.
Stephanie, I mean, you've been around many political science workshops in India, which say that in India, cities don't get attention because they're only 30% urban. Right? If only we had more urban people, the cities would get more attention. And yet, in these three countries, with overwhelming majority of the citizens being urban, it seems to be the same story. How would you explain it?
I don't. I don't explain. But for once, I had something to say in answer to your last question.
Okay,
so
right.
we're bound to be, in décalage. But no, what I wanted to say is, what does the city feel about the city? And it's very difficult to say. I mean, a city, especially like a city of Delhi, 17 million people, highly, different type of settlements. Many different people feel many different things. So from my perspective, talking to elected representatives, local level bureaucrats and citizens engaged in various participatory experiences, what comes up is the idea of the world-class city. And that comes up only with resident welfare associations. And I think here we have a case where a group of, a section of the urban population has managed to speak in a language, in a vocabulary that resonates with the vocabulary used by the city elites. And I think the fact that the RWAs have been arguing that their action actually is in favor of making Delhi a world-class city has a lot to do with the fact that they became such an important force, for instance, when there was a conflict in 2006 in Delhi over land use. And suddenly RWAs did appear as a strong actor of urban governance, along with judges and against the elected government and MLAs. So the notion of the world-class city, I think, is very strong when you read the newspapers about Delhi affairs, etc. But it has nothing to do with saving the planet or changing the urbanization of India. It really is about your own prestige and what you feel is should be your own status in the country as a whole.
So but as a political scientist, you really feel that this notion of city getting attention is more about who is forced to devolve at what level. Because people demanding attention, all these large urban populations in these countries demanding attention. Somehow we seem to have the notion and the idea that if India was 70% urban, our cities would look and feel different. Because urban issues would somehow become national issues. And yet, one of the takeaways I'm getting from this panel is that is not an automatic outcome. In the same way that in Delhi, of course, the majority of people, political preferences don't count in the way, and therefore this notion of the world-class city, the government level which manages land in the city, is not subject to the political will of the citizens of Delhi, the people who live in the city, because that's the federal government agency that manages the land in the city. And which is where, when Stephanie talks about the 2006 land use thing, which again recurred recently, about mixed land use. And eventually, there was quite an agitation protest, as you said, as a means of participation by the trading community in Delhi. And they were powerful enough to bring forth mixed land use as a planning mechanism within Delhi at that point in time. And in some senses, perhaps one of the few times when the voice of a certain section of people in Delhi was heard at the national level in terms of agenda setting and structure and going forward. And the reason I'm asking this is twofold. One is, as I said, one of the issues is this large urban story really a viable story given the change in technology? And asking whether this is a question that is even being asked around the world. And secondly, are these megacities really so big that it's difficult to think of political participation at that particular scale? So, is your idea of the metropolitan democracy, to begin with you, Stephanie, is that, how feasible do you think it is, the scale at which we are currently operating? Are these cities becoming too big to be democratic? Or are there ways around that particular problem?
Well, I think that if metropolitan democracy has to exist, then it has to be organized in a very structured kind of way, starting with neighborhood democracy. I mean, I think the first challenge is neighborhood democracy in the real sense. I mean, in Delhi we've had a number of dispositives which have tried to organize neighborhood democracy and which have failed in a way or the other, because none of them managed to organize an interaction between citizens and local bureaucrats and local elected representatives. The Mohalla Sabha is almost there, but the Mohalla Sabha is in a kind of limbo just now. So it is very difficult. It is a real challenge. But at the same time, I think that, for instance, mobilizations in cities, in large cities in India today, get a lot of media attention, more than mobilization in the countryside. I was struck by the fact that the farmers' march recently, converging to Delhi, got, from what I could read, through the internet, but I do read, two newspapers every day, it seemed to me it got very little attention, when compared to the magnitude of the issue. When you think of the anti-corruption movement, the Hazare movement, which took place in 2011 and 2012, in a few cities in India, gathering interesting crowds. I mean, interesting because these are not usually the crowds that you see in mobilizations in India. I mean, these were urban middle-class people speaking in English, etc. But still, I mean, these crowds are nothing compared to usual, parties meetings in rural India or in smaller cities. So I think that there is a lot of de facto media attention, media focus on large cities, and that the picture we get through the media is probably distorted, and we have to work on this also as researchers.
Is that, would you say that is also true in Russia? That Moscow features a lot more than problems of Moscow are much more in the media than the problems of Vladivostok?
No, it depends. I think it depends on the situation. For example, if there is a so-called East Economic Forum in Vladivostok, where all governments there, then it will be the top story. But if something is going in Moscow on the same level, then Moscow is the top story.
If there's a water crisis in Vladivostok and a water crisis in
Moscow, if it will be, hopefully there will no crisis in there, but if it will happen, I think it will be quite well known about it. It's for sure, because first of all, it will be anyway known by people through the social networks, but generally speaking, such kind of events are not hidden. I mean, government's not trying to hide it because
it's also I think what Stephanie was talking about is not so much active hiding, it's just the fact that the nature of the media organization is such that fewer reporters in smaller places, fewer advertisers who are based in that kind of structures, and therefore their problems are not as seem to be as worthy of being put front and center as, but that's not really the case yet.
I think that, as far as I can see, of course, that, say, classical or traditional media is losing their influence, because in Russia at least, because a lot of new things like social networks, so-called telegram channels and blogs, which are really very important. I mean, they are translating a lot more information than traditional media, and therefore it's impossible to hide something or trying to to distort the real situation. I mean, it's therefore it's kind of not democracy maybe, but it's kind of public involvement and engagement.
No, I'm just wondering about this issue, about this relationship between democracy and big cities. Because in Brazil, if you don't address the solution to the urban segregation, urban problems and inequalities, in the democratic context, I think that the society become more and more conflicted, you know. So you need a government more anti-democratic, with anti-democratic attitude, because in Brazil the urban problems during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the urban problems aggravated, and the society was under control of a dictatorship. After the 80s, when we start the redemocratization process, all these urban problems aggravated, the inequalities aggravated, and the society in the democratic context start to protest, to demonstrate in all their agendas. They start to act more and more intense in the public space, in the streets. And then now we are having an anti-democratic federal government. I think that it is strictly related. You know, when you cannot solve the urban problems in the big cities, the consequences is an anti-democratic government, because the society gets more confusion, more conflicted. This is what we are discussing in Brazil right now. This is the price that we are paying for not having a national urban development policy to solve all these our urban policies. I think that this is so linked.
So if I'm looking at the issues now, from what I've briefly summarized, one issue that you seem to flag is the big city is not only difficult to have democratic participation, but might actually lead to anti-democratic backlashes in some sense, not solving that problem. The second is, if you're looking at it, is it's not essential that the big cities be the ones that always will succeed going forward from what you're saying now. And that political participation or political strength of these big cities don't really leads to their influence in terms of governing national policy towards urbanization, which all turns out to be a very bleak picture. But